England, 1821. The season arrived with its usual pageantry, transforming London into a glittering stage where fortunes were made and futures decided. For most young ladies, it represented hope, possibility, the promise of advantageous matches and social triumph. For Miss Elizabeth Thornton, it marked the beginning of her 5th year as a spectator to other women's happiness. The assembly rooms at Almack's hummed with conversation and music, the chandeliers casting warm light over silk gowns and polished jewels. Elizabeth occupied her customary position near the refreshment table, her posture impeccable despite the weight of familiarity that pressed upon her shoulders. Her gown of pale lavender had been cunningly altered from 2 seasons prior, the lace carefully repositioned to suggest novelty to those who might notice such details. "Miss Thornton, might I fetch you some lemonade?" asked Miss Pemberton, a kind-hearted widow who had taken to offering small kindnesses to Elizabeth over the years. "You are most generous, but I find myself adequately refreshed," Elizabeth replied, her smile practiced to perfection, revealing nothing of the loneliness that had become her constant companion. She was the daughter of a country squire whose modest estate provided comfort, but little excess. At 24, she possessed neither extraordinary beauty nor significant fortune, those twin pillars upon which matrimonial success was built. Her features were pleasant enough, her figure acceptable, her accomplishments adequate. She was, in every way, unremarkable, a fact that society had made abundantly clear through 5 seasons of polite neglect. Across the room, her younger cousin Harriet laughed with a circle of admirers, her golden curls catching the light as she accepted yet another invitation to dance. Harriet had arrived in London only this season, yet had already collected 3 proposals of marriage. The contrast between them was not lost on Elizabeth, though she bore her cousin no ill will for possessing the charm and vivacity that she herself lacked. "Harriet is in fine spirits this evening," observed her aunt, Lady Thornton, who had appeared at Elizabeth's side with a cup of punch she would not drink. "Lord Ashford seems quite taken with her. A viscount with 10,000 a year would be a splendid match." "Harriet would grace any position," Elizabeth agreed, accustomed to her aunt's pointed observations about her cousin's prospects. "And if only you had cultivated a more engaging manner," Lady Thornton continued with the casual cruelty of one who believes herself helpful. "A young lady cannot expect to attract notice through silence and retiring behavior." Elizabeth had heard such counsel countless times, yet her nature resisted transformation. She could no more become vivacious and charming than she could command the moon to change its course. Some women were born to command attention, others were destined to observe from the margins. The orchestra struck up a cotillion, and couples arranged themselves for the dance. Elizabeth watched with the detachment of long practice, her expression carefully neutral. 5 years of watching had taught her to mask the yearning that still, foolishly, persisted in her breast. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted, conversations faltering as heads turned toward the entrance. Elizabeth glanced up, curiosity overcoming her usual indifference, and felt her breath catch. Alexander Beaumont, Duke of Pemberton, had entered Almack's, tall and commanding, dressed in black evening clothes that accentuated his broad shoulders and aristocratic bearing. The Duke moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference. At 35, he was one of the most powerful peers in England, known for his vast estates, his political influence, and his decided aversion to matrimony. They called him the Iron Duke, not merely for his formidable business acumen and unwavering principles, but for the impenetrable reserve that kept society at a distance. He attended few social functions, granted fewer private audiences, and had never, in living memory, shown interest in any young lady seeking his attention. His presence at Almack's was so unprecedented that speculation rippled through the assembly, like wind across water. Every unmarried lady, and several married ones, followed his progress with barely concealed interest. Elizabeth observed him with academic curiosity, much as one might study a rare specimen in a museum. Men of the Duke's stature existed in a realm entirely separate from her own. The Duke's gaze swept the room with methodical precision, as though conducting an inventory. Elizabeth thought nothing of it until his eyes settled upon her with unmistakable focus. She looked behind her, certain his attention must be directed elsewhere, but found only the wall and a potted fern. When she turned back, he was approaching with purposeful strides, the crowd parting before him. Elizabeth rose on trembling legs, executing a curtsy that years of training rendered automatic despite her shock. "Your Grace." "Miss Thornton, I believe." His voice was deep, cultured, with an edge that suggested he was unaccustomed to uncertainty. "You have the advantage of me, Your Grace," she managed, her composure holding despite her racing heart. A slight smile touched his lips, transforming his severe features momentarily. "I make it my habit to know those who interest me." The statement was so unexpected that Elizabeth nearly laughed. "Then I fear your sources have misled you, Your Grace. I am quite possibly the least interesting person in this room." Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or approval. "I find that those who claim to be uninteresting are often the most fascinating upon closer acquaintance." The orchestra began a waltz, that still controversial dance that required partners to hold one another with scandalous proximity. The Duke extended his gloved hand with an air of command that permitted no refusal. "Dance with me, Miss Thornton." It was not a request, but a declaration, softly spoken yet absolute in its expectation. Elizabeth knew she should decline. Dancing with the Duke of Pemberton would invite scrutiny, gossip, and inevitable disappointment when nothing came of it. She had spent 5 years cultivating anonymity as protection against society's cruelty, yet her hand moved of its own volition, settling into his palm with surprising naturalness. "Yes, Your Grace." As he led her onto the floor, every eye in the assembly followed them. Miss Pemberton looked as though she might faint. Harriet's mouth formed a perfect circle of astonishment. And Lady Georgiana Hartley, the season's acknowledged beauty with her considerable dowry and impeccable lineage, watched with narrowed eyes as the Duke, whom everyone assumed would eventually offer for her, instead took the hand of forgotten Elizabeth Thornton. "The entire room is staring," Elizabeth murmured as the Duke's hand settled at her waist with unexpected gentleness. "Let them," he replied, drawing her into the waltz with practiced ease. Dancing with the Duke of Pemberton was like being caught in a summer storm, exhilarating and slightly terrifying, the world reduced to the space between them while chaos swirled beyond. He moved with fluid grace that seemed at odds with his imposing stature, guiding her through the steps as though they had danced together countless times. "You dance remarkably well, Miss Thornton," he observed, his expression unreadable. "The advantage of 5 seasons' observation, Your Grace," she replied without thinking. "One has ample opportunity to study technique when not engaged in dancing oneself." His grip tightened fractionally at her waist. "You speak with unusual candor." "A habit my aunt despairs of correcting." Elizabeth found herself relaxing slightly, the rhythm of the dance grounding her anxiety. "I have discovered that when one has little to lose, honesty becomes less costly." "And you believe you have little to lose?" "I am 24, Your Grace, with modest fortune and no particular accomplishments to recommend me. Society has already rendered its verdict on my prospects." The Duke's dark eyes studied her face with intensity that made her breath catch. "Society's verdicts are often short-sighted and frequently wrong. I have found that the most valuable things are often overlooked by those who lack discernment." Before Elizabeth could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, the waltz concluded. The Duke escorted her back to her position near the refreshment table, bowed formally over her hand, then leaned closer, his voice low enough for her ears alone. "I would speak with you further, Miss Thornton. Perhaps you might join me in the conservatory in 10 minutes. It is just beyond the card room." The impropriety of such a meeting should have scandalized her, yet Elizabeth found herself nodding before wisdom could intervene. The Duke straightened, gave her a look that seemed to contain both warning and promise, then strode away, leaving speculation and whispers in his wake. 10 minutes later, having excused herself with a murmured word to Miss Pemberton, Elizabeth found herself in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants and the earthy scent of hothouse flowers. Moonlight streamed through the glass panels, casting silver patterns across the tiled floor. "Miss Thornton." The Duke's voice emerged from the shadows before he stepped into the light, his tall figure imposing against the foliage. "Your Grace." Elizabeth kept her voice steady despite the impropriety of their meeting. "I confess myself curious about what matter requires such clandestine conversation." "I find myself in need of a wife," he stated without preamble. Elizabeth blinked, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon." "I require a wife," he repeated, moving closer, his features now clearly visible in the moonlight, "and I believe you would suit my requirements admirably." "Your requirements," Elizabeth echoed, her mind struggling to comprehend his meaning. The Duke clasped his hands behind his back, his posture suggesting this was a business proposition rather than a romantic overture. "My mother, the Dowager Duchess, has issued an ultimatum. If I do not marry by my 36th birthday, which is 3 months hence, she will exercise her legal right to claim residence at Pemberton House in London and assume control of various family assets that remain under her jointure." "I see," Elizabeth said slowly, though she failed to see how this concerned her. "My mother and I have fundamental disagreements about the management of the estates, and, more significantly, about my involvement in political reform. She considers my support for various progressive measures to be dangerous radicalism that brings shame upon the family name." Understanding began to dawn, and a marriage would prevent her from exercising this control. "Precisely." He nodded approvingly. "The marriage settlement would supersede her jointure rights, transferring those assets to my wife instead. Additionally, married peers are viewed as more stable and respectable in parliamentary circles, which would strengthen my position on various reforms I wish to champion." "But surely a man of your position could have any number of suitable brides," Elizabeth protested. "Lady Georgiana Hartley has made her interest abundantly clear. She possesses beauty, fortune, and impeccable connections." The Duke's expression hardened. "Like Lady Georgiana and women of her ilk seek the prestige of being a duchess above all else. They would expect elaborate entertainments, constant social engagements, and a husband who conforms to society's expectations. I have neither the time nor the inclination for such a life." "And you believe I would not have such expectations because—" Elizabeth trailed off, understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity. "Because you have observed society from its periphery for 5 years, he said with brutal honesty. "You understand its superficiality and its cruelties. You speak directly when others would dissemble and flatter. And," he added, his gaze steady, "your circumstances are such that a practical arrangement would be welcome rather than insulting." Heat rose to Elizabeth's cheeks, born not of maidenly embarrassment but of indignation. "You have investigated my family's finances." "I investigate everything that concerns my interests, Miss Thornton. Your father's estate is modest but well managed. You have no brothers, and upon his death, the property will pass to a distant cousin, leaving you and your mother dependent upon the charity of relations. An alliance with me would secure your family's future and provide you with independence and resources to pursue your own interests." "And what precisely would this practical arrangement entail?" Elizabeth asked, her mind racing through implications. "Marriage, naturally. You would become the Duchess of Pemberton, mistress of Blackmore Abbey in Derbyshire, and Pemberton House in London. Your father's debts would be settled, and a generous allowance established for your mother. In return, you would provide the social respectability I require and, when necessary, appear at my side at essential functions. And after this arrangement serves its purpose." Elizabeth moved to examine a potted orchid, needing to look at something other than his penetrating gaze. "What then, Your Grace?" "We would continue as we began. You would have your own apartments at both residences. Your time would be your own, to pursue whatever interests you wish. We would maintain separate lives while presenting a united front to society when required." "A marriage in name only, then?" Elizabeth said quietly, surprised by the pang of disappointment that accompanied this realization. "Unless both parties agree otherwise," the Duke replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I do not seek to impose unwelcome obligations upon you, Miss Thornton. This would be a partnership of mutual benefit, nothing more nor less than what many aristocratic marriages have been throughout history. Elizabeth turned to face him, studying the man who proposed to alter her life so dramatically. He stood in the moonlight, every inch the powerful Duke, yet something in his bearing suggested vulnerability beneath the armor of authority. "And what if I refuse, Your Grace?" "Then I shall seek another solution," he replied honestly. "Another practical bride's, if you will. Though I confess," he added, his expression softening slightly, "I find myself hoping you will not refuse. There is something about you, Miss Thornton, that suggests you would be a most agreeable companion in this endeavor." Before Elizabeth could respond, voices approached the conservatory, forcing them apart. The Duke stepped back into the shadows with practiced ease. "Consider my proposal," he said quietly. "I shall call upon you tomorrow at 2 o'clock to discuss terms. Your father will receive a letter from my solicitor in the morning, outlining the financial arrangements." "You seem very certain of my acceptance," Elizabeth observed. "I am certain only that the proposal merits serious consideration," he corrected. "Until tomorrow, Miss Thornton." With a formal bow, he departed through a different door, leaving Elizabeth alone among the exotic flowers with a decision that would determine the course of her entire life. She returned to the assembly to find her aunt in a state of agitation, surrounded by curious matrons eager for information about Elizabeth's dance with the Duke. Harriet pulled her aside at the first opportunity, her eyes wide with excitement. "Lizzie, you danced with the Duke of Pemberton, the Duke of Pemberton. Whatever did he say to you? Is he as fearsome as they claim? Oh, this is the most exciting thing that has happened all season." Elizabeth managed to deflect most questions with vague pleasantries, claiming the Duke had merely been courteous to a neglected wallflower. Yet as she lay in bed that night, sleep eluding her despite her exhaustion, she found herself seriously considering the Duke's proposal. What were her alternatives? Truly? Another 5 seasons of watching from the margins until she aged out of even token consideration? Becoming the spinster aunt who lived on the charity of married relations? At least the Duke's arrangement offered honesty. There would be no pretense of love, no false promises to be later broken, just a clear agreement between two people who understood the transaction. The following afternoon, precisely at 2 o'clock, the Duke of Pemberton was announced at her father's modest townhouse. Elizabeth received him in the small drawing room, her father present as propriety demanded, though clearly bewildered by the Duke's interest in his unremarkable daughter. "Mr. Thornton," the Duke began without preamble, "I have come to request your daughter's hand in marriage. My solicitor has already presented the settlement terms to your man of business. I believe you will find them more than generous." Her father, a scholarly man who had never quite grasped the intricacies of society, blinked in astonishment. "Your Grace, this is most unexpected. Elizabeth is of course a wonderful girl, but I had not realized you were acquainted." "We met at Almack's last evening," the Duke replied smoothly. "I was struck immediately by Miss Thornton's intelligence and dignified bearing. In these matters, I find that decisive action serves better than prolonged courtship." It was a masterful performance, Elizabeth thought, watching him navigate her father's confusion with practiced skill. Within 30 minutes, her father had granted his consent, too overwhelmed by the Duke's rank and the extraordinary settlement terms to raise objections. Elizabeth herself had said little, merely nodding when asked if she was amenable to the match. After her father excused himself to review documents with the solicitor, Elizabeth found herself alone with the Duke once more. "You are very skilled at managing people," she observed. "A necessary talent for one in my position," he acknowledged. "Have you made your decision, Miss Thornton?" Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "I have conditions of my own, Your Grace." His eyebrows rose with interest. "Indeed, I would hear them." "I wish to establish a lending library in the village near Blackmore Abbey. I understand the current facilities are inadequate. I would require funds and autonomy to manage this project." "Granted," he said without hesitation. "What else?" I wish to correspond regularly with my mother and to have her visit at Blackmore as often as she wishes, without restriction. Of course. Family connections are important. Continue. And I wish it understood that while I will fulfill my obligations as Duchess in public, I will not be subject to criticism or correction of my behavior in private. If this is to be a partnership, it must be one of equals, at least within the walls of our own homes. The Duke studied her for a long moment, then slowly smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his severe features. You surprise me, Miss Thornton. I had expected meek acceptance, yet you negotiate like a seasoned diplomat. You proposed a business arrangement, Your Grace. I merely ensure the terms are acceptable to both parties. You shall have everything you request, he said, extending his hand. Do we have an agreement? Elizabeth placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his palm through their gloves. We have an agreement, Your Grace. Alexander, he corrected. When we are private, you must call me Alexander. We are to be married, after all. Alexander, she repeated, finding the name strange on her tongue. And you must call me Elizabeth. Elizabeth, he said, and something in the way he spoke her name sent an unexpected warmth through her. I believe we shall deal very well together. The wedding took place 3 weeks later at St. George's, Hanover Square. Attended by a small gathering of family and essential witnesses, the Dowager Duchess was notably absent, having retired to the Dower House in High Dudgeon upon learning of her son's engagement to the nobody daughter of an insignificant country squire. The ton was divided between those scandalized by the Duke's choice and those intrigued by the mystery of his sudden interest in the long-overlooked Miss Thornton. Elizabeth wore a gown of cream silk with minimal adornment, her dark hair arranged simply beneath a veil that had belonged to her grandmother. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she caught Alexander's eye and was surprised to see approval in his gaze. Whatever this marriage might become, at least it began with mutual respect. The ceremony was brief, the vows spoken with clear voices that belied any uncertainty. When Alexander lifted her veil to bestow the ceremonial kiss, his lips were warm and gentle against hers, a promise of consideration if not passion. The wedding breakfast was a modest affair, after which Elizabeth bid farewell to her parents and cousin, embracing her mother with promises to write weekly. Then she entered the ducal carriage beside her new husband, bound for Blackmore Abbey in Derbyshire. The journey took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a respectable inn where they maintained separate chambers. Alexander proved to be an agreeable traveling companion, discussing books and current affairs without condescension, listening to her opinions with apparent genuine interest. Elizabeth found herself relaxing in his company, the careful formality between them easing into something approaching camaraderie. You seem thoughtful, Alexander observed as their carriage rolled through the Derbyshire countryside on the second day. I was reflecting on how strange life is, Elizabeth admitted. 3 weeks ago, I believed my future was settled, that I would live out my days as a spinster, dependent on the charity of relations. Now I'm a duchess, traveling to an estate I have never seen, married to a man I scarcely know. And how do you feel about this transformation? Elizabeth considered the question carefully. Uncertain, she said honestly, but not unhappy. This arrangement offers me opportunities I never dared hope for. Whatever else it may be, I am grateful for that. And I am grateful for a wife who speaks her mind, Alexander replied. Many women would pretend to romantic sentiments they do not feel, making our arrangement more complicated than necessary. You need not fear such pretense from me, Elizabeth assured him. I entered this marriage with clear understanding of its nature. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to interpret. Of course, it is what we agreed upon. Blackmore Abbey appeared on the horizon like something from a Gothic novel, its medieval towers and crenellations rising against the gray Derbyshire sky. The carriage rolled through impressive gates and up a long drive flanked by ancient oaks, finally stopping before the grand entrance. It's rather imposing, Elizabeth murmured, suddenly aware of the vast responsibility she had assumed. Blackmore has stood for 600 years, Alexander said, descending from the carriage and turning to hand her down. It was a fortress once, designed to withstand siege. Now it is simply a very large, very drafty house that requires constant maintenance. His dry humor eased her apprehension. You make it sound quite romantic. Wait until winter, when the north wind howls through the corridors despite our best efforts to seal every crack. Then you shall find it considerably less romantic. The staff was assembled in 2 neat lines in the great hall, a vaulted chamber with hammer-beam ceiling and walls hung with ancestral portraits. Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, stepped forward with a respectful curtsy. Your Grace, welcome home, and may I be the first to welcome Her Grace to Blackmore Abbey. Thank you, Mrs. Crawford, Alexander replied with easy authority. But I trust all is in readiness. Yes, Your Grace. The Duchess's apartments have been prepared according to your instructions, and dinner will be served at 8 o'clock. Elizabeth smiled warmly at the housekeeper. Thank you, Mrs. Crawford. I look forward to becoming better acquainted with you and the entire staff. If Mrs. Crawford was surprised by such friendliness from a duchess, she concealed it admirably. It would be my honor to conduct you on a tour of the house tomorrow morning, Your Grace, after you have rested from your journey. That would be most helpful, Elizabeth replied. Alexander placed a hand at the small of her back, a gesture that appeared husbandly to observers but felt curiously impersonal. Mrs. Crawford will show you to your apartments now. I have estate business requiring attention, but I shall join you for dinner. With that, he was gone, striding away down a corridor with the confidence of one who knows every stone of his domain. Elizabeth watched him go, struck by the realization that this vast house and this enigmatic man were now her life. Mrs. Crawford led her through a bewildering series of corridors and staircases to the Duchess's apartments in the East Wing. The suite proved to be surprisingly comfortable, a sitting room decorated in soft blues and greens that opened into a bedchamber of understated elegance. Beyond lay a dressing room and a bathing chamber with modern conveniences that represented luxury to someone raised in her father's modest household. His Grace had the apartments entirely refurbished after your engagement, Mrs. Crawford informed her. He was most particular about the details, Your Grace. How thoughtful, Elizabeth replied, wondering if Alexander's attention to detail stemmed from consideration or merely his habitual thoroughness in all matters. A maid appeared, introduced as Susan, who helped Elizabeth change from her traveling costume into a more comfortable afternoon dress. Once alone, Elizabeth moved to the window, which offered a view of extensive gardens and, beyond them, the wild beauty of the Derbyshire moors stretching to the horizon. She had exchanged one form of invisibility for another, she reflected. As Miss Thornton, she had been overlooked in ballrooms. As the Duchess of Pemberton, she would be noticed, scrutinized, but no less alone in the essential ways that mattered. Yet this loneliness came with purpose and resources to effect real change, starting with the lending library she planned for the village. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Enter, she called. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his imposing figure filling the frame. I hope you find the apartments satisfactory. They are lovely, Elizabeth assured him. Thank you for your attention to their preparation. He moved into the room, his gaze assessing. I wished you to be comfortable. This will be your home now, Elizabeth. I want you to feel you belong here. That is kind, she replied, surprised by what seemed like genuine concern. It is practical, he corrected, though his tone held warmth. An unhappy wife would make our arrangement considerably more difficult. Of course, Elizabeth said, reminding herself not to mistake consideration for deeper feeling. Silence fell between them, neither uncomfortable nor easy, simply unfilled. Alexander cleared his throat. There is something I should mention. My mother, the Dowager Duchess, resides at the Dower House, which is situated about 2 miles distant. She has indicated no desire to meet you or to acknowledge our marriage. I see, Elizabeth said carefully. That must be difficult for you. His expression hardened. My mother and I have been at odds for many years, since my father's death when I was 20. She believes I mismanaged the estates and disgraced the family name through my political activities. Our marriage, to someone she considers beneath my station, has merely confirmed her worst opinions of my judgment. I am sorry to be the cause of further estrangement between you, Elizabeth said softly. You are not the cause, Alexander replied firmly. The estrangement existed long before you. If anything, marrying you despite her opposition has brought me a certain satisfaction. A slight smile touched his lips. Though I confess that makes me sound petty. It makes you sound human, Elizabeth countered. Family relationships are seldom simple. He studied her face as though seeing her anew. You have an unusual perspective, Elizabeth. Most women in your position would be devastated by the dowager's rejection. Most women in my position would expect to be embraced by their new family, Elizabeth pointed out. I entered this marriage with no such expectations. Your mother's opinion of me cannot wound where I have no hope of approval. That is a remarkably philosophical approach to being snubbed by the Dowager Duchess of Pemberton. Perhaps 5 years as a wallflower has its advantages, Elizabeth said with a slight smile. One develops a certain immunity to social slights. Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his austere features. I begin to think I chose more wisely than I knew, Elizabeth. You have unexpected depths. Before she could respond, a clock somewhere in the house chimed the hour. Alexander straightened. I must return to my estate business. Dinner at 8, as Mrs. Crawford indicated. Until then, please feel free to explore your new home. After he departed, Elizabeth did indeed explore, discovering a music room with a pianoforte, a library that would take years to fully appreciate, and a conservatory filled with exotic plants. Everywhere she went, servants bowed or curtsied, addressing her as Your Grace, with a deference that still felt surreal. That evening, she dressed carefully for dinner with Susan's assistance, choosing a gown of deep rose silk that was the finest she had ever worn. When she descended to the dining room, she found Alexander already there, looking distinguished in evening attire. You look lovely, he said, pulling out her chair with courtly grace. Thank you, Elizabeth replied, taking her seat at his right hand rather than at the opposite end of the impossibly long table. Dinner was an elaborate affair, course after course served by silent footmen, while she and Alexander maintained conversation about estate matters and local concerns. He consulted her opinion on various improvements he was considering, listening to her suggestions with apparent respect. The evening passed more pleasantly than Elizabeth had anticipated, though she remained acutely aware of the careful formality that characterized their interaction. As they retired for the evening, Alexander escorted her to her apartments. They paused at her door, both suddenly uncertain. Good night, Elizabeth, he said finally. I hope you sleep well. Good night, Alexander, she replied, then added on impulse. Thank you for today. You have been most considerate. Something warm flickered in his eyes. It is my duty to ensure your comfort. You are the Duchess of Pemberton now. Your contentment reflects upon me. Always duty, Elizabeth thought as she prepared for bed. Always practical considerations. She reminded herself that she had entered this marriage with clear understanding of its parameters. She had no right to feel disappointed that Alexander treated her with exactly the considerate distance they had agreed upon. Yet as she lay in her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home, Elizabeth could not quite suppress the small, foolish part of her heart that wished their practical arrangement might somehow transform into something more. The weeks that followed established patterns that would define Elizabeth's new life. Her days were filled with learning the intricacies of managing a great household, consulting with Mrs. Crawford about menus and household schedules, and gradually earning the trust of staff who had served the Duke for years. Alexander was unfailingly courteous, joining her for dinner each evening where they engaged in pleasant conversation about estate matters and current affairs, but maintaining the careful distance their arrangement prescribed. Elizabeth threw herself into establishing the lending library she had requested, working with the village vicar to identify a suitable building and consulting with Alexander about which books to acquire. He supported her efforts without interference, providing generous funding while allowing her complete autonomy over the project. It was, she reflected, exactly what he had promised: resources and independence without emotional entanglement. One morning, as Elizabeth worked in the small study she had claimed as her own domain, Mrs. Crawford appeared with unusual hesitation. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but the Dowager Duchess has arrived and insists upon seeing His Grace immediately." Elizabeth set down her pen with careful precision. "Is the Duke available?" "He is out riding the estate, Your Grace. He is not expected to return for another 2 hours." "I see." Elizabeth considered her options. Please show the Dowager Duchess to the gold drawing room and inform her that the Duke will attend her upon his return. Offer refreshments with my compliments." Mrs. Crawford looked uncertain. "Your Grace, perhaps you might wish to greet the Dowager yourself." "I think not, Mrs. Crawford," Elizabeth replied calmly. "The Dowager Duchess has made her feelings about this marriage abundantly clear. I will not force my presence upon her." Yet curiosity, and perhaps a hint of defiance, led Elizabeth to position herself in the library adjacent to the gold drawing room 30 minutes later, where she could observe the Dowager through the partially open door without being seen herself. Lady Pemberton was a handsome woman in her late 50s, her posture rigid with aristocratic bearing, her features arranged in an expression of perpetual disapproval. She paced the drawing room like a general planning a campaign, occasionally pausing to examine some object with critical interest. When Alexander finally arrived, still in riding clothes, his expression hardened at the sight of his mother. "Madam," he said coolly, "this is unexpected. I see you still display the same appalling lack of courtesy, appearing before me in such disarray." The Dowager replied with equal coldness. "I came immediately upon learning of your arrival, which I assumed indicated some matter of urgency. If you prefer, I can change and return in an hour. Do not be absurd." The Dowager seated herself with regal bearing. "I have come to discuss this disgraceful marriage you have contracted. There is nothing to discuss. I am married. The settlement is complete, and your jointure rights are now void. I believe that concludes all business between us." "How dare you speak to your mother with such insolence?" The Dowager's composure cracked slightly. "I raised you, Alexander. I guided you through your father's death and your assumption of the title. This is how you repay me, by marrying some nobody to spite me. I married to secure my independence and to prevent you from interfering further in my affairs," Alexander replied, his voice hard. "Miss Thornton's origins are irrelevant. She is now the Duchess of Pemberton, and you will accord her the respect that position demands." "Respect?" The Dowager's laugh was bitter. "For a girl whose father is barely a gentleman? For a woman who sat unwanted through 5 seasons because no one of consequence would have her? You have made yourself a laughingstock, Alexander, and degraded the family name in the process." Elizabeth flinched at the words, though she had heard similar sentiments from society often enough. What surprised her was Alexander's response, the flash of genuine anger that transformed his features. "You know nothing of Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She possesses more genuine dignity and intelligence than most of the so-called ladies of quality who parade through London ballrooms. Her worth is not diminished by her father's income, or by society's inability to recognize quality when it lacks a fashionable pedigree. You defend her as though you actually care for the girl," the Dowager said skeptically. "We both know this marriage is a transaction, nothing more. What exists between my wife and myself is none of your concern," Alexander replied coldly. "You are no longer welcome at Blackmore Abbey, Mother. If you wish to communicate with me, you may do so through my solicitor. You would banish your own mother." "I would protect my wife from insult and disrespect," he corrected. "You have made your feelings clear. Now I have made mine equally clear. Good day, madam." The Dowager rose with fury in every line of her body. "You will regret this, Alexander. When your political reforms fail and your precious nobody wife proves inadequate to her position, you will understand the folly of defying me. The only regret I carry is that it took me so long to establish boundaries with you," Alexander replied with finality. "Jenkins will see you out." After the Dowager's departure, Elizabeth remained in the library, her emotions in tumult. She had expected Alexander to defend her as a matter of form, but the genuine anger in his voice, the protective edge to his words, had been unexpected. Before she could fully process what she had witnessed, the library door opened, and Alexander entered. "You heard?" he stated, rather than asked, his expression unreadable. "I did," Elizabeth admitted, seeing no point in dissembling. "I apologize for eavesdropping. It was unworthy of me. Yet, understandable, given the circumstances." He moved to the window, his back to her. "My mother has a cruel tongue. I hope her words did not wound you." "I have heard worse," Elizabeth replied honestly. 5 seasons of being overlooked provides one with a thick skin regarding social opinion. Alexander turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "As you should not have to endure such treatment, particularly not in your own home. I meant what I said to my mother. You are the Duchess of Pemberton, and you deserve respect." "Because it reflects upon you," Elizabeth said, echoing his earlier words about her contentment. "No," he said firmly, crossing the room to stand before her. "Because you are a woman of character and intelligence who deserves respect in your own right, regardless of whose wife you happen to be." The sincerity in his voice caught Elizabeth off guard. "That is kind of you to say." "It is not kindness, it is truth." His hand reached out, hesitating a moment before gently touching her arm. "I fear our arrangement has been more difficult for you than I anticipated. My mother's hostility adds to your burdens. I knew when I accepted your proposal that I would not be welcomed by all," Elizabeth replied. "Your mother's opinion does not diminish what this marriage has given me: security, purpose, independence. I do not regret our agreement, Alexander." "Nor do I," he said quietly, his hand still resting on her arm. "Though I confess the agreement feels increasingly inadequate to describe what has developed between us." Elizabeth's heart quickened at his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have come to value your company beyond its practical utility," he admitted, his expression vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "I find myself thinking of you throughout the day, looking forward to our evening conversations, admiring your kindness to the staff and your dedication to the library project. You have made Blackmore feel like a home, rather than merely an estate to be managed." "Alexander," Elizabeth breathed, hardly daring to hope he meant what his words suggested. "I am not expressing myself well," he continued, frustration evident in his tone. "I'm accustomed to speaking of contracts and obligations, not feelings, but I would be dishonest if I did not acknowledge that what I feel for you has evolved beyond what our original agreement contemplated." "I have developed feelings for you as well," Elizabeth confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to guard against it, to maintain the practical distance we agreed upon, but I find it increasingly difficult to think of you merely as the Duke rather than as Alexander, the man who selected books he thought I would enjoy for my library project, who asks my opinion on estate matters as though my thoughts have value, who defended me to his mother with such vehemence." His hand moved from her arm to cup her face with surprising gentleness. "Then perhaps we might consider renegotiating the terms of our arrangement. I no longer wish to maintain separate lives that intersect only at dinner and public occasions. I wish to know you, truly know you, and to allow you to know me in return." "What are you proposing?" Elizabeth asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "That we transform our marriage of convenience into something more genuine," he replied, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I cannot promise grand passion or romantic declarations. I am not constructed that way, but I can promise honesty, respect, and a sincere desire to build a true partnership with you." "I would like that very much," Elizabeth said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never expected to find companionship in this marriage, much less something deeper, but these weeks with you have shown me a man of principle and unexpected kindness beneath the formidable exterior." Alexander smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his features. "Then we are agreed. A new arrangement, one based on mutual regard rather than mere mutual benefit." He leaned forward, and Elizabeth met him halfway, their lips joining in a kiss that held all the promise of their evolving connection. Unlike the ceremonial kiss at their wedding, this was a kiss of genuine feeling, tentative yet meaningful, the beginning of something neither had anticipated but both now welcomed. When they parted, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you, I am not well versed in the art of courtship. You may find my attempts at romance rather clumsy." "Then we shall learn together," Elizabeth replied with a smile. "I'm no expert in being courted, having spent 5 years being overlooked. We are both novices in this endeavor. A fact I find strangely reassuring," he admitted. "Shall we begin with a walk in the gardens? Mrs. Crawford mentioned you have been spending considerable time planning improvements to the rose garden." "I would enjoy that very much," Elizabeth said, accepting his offered arm. As they walked through Blackmore's extensive gardens, discussing plans for new plantings and debating the merits of various rose varieties, Elizabeth marveled at the strange turns life could take. She had entered this marriage expecting nothing beyond security and independence, yet here she was, walking arm in arm with her husband, discovering the tentative beginnings of genuine affection. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to their relationship. Alexander began joining Elizabeth for breakfast rather than taking his morning meal in his study. They rode together across the estate, he on his powerful hunter, and she on the gentle mare he had purchased specifically for her use. In the evenings, rather than separating immediately after dinner, they would sit together in the library, reading companionably or discussing the books she was acquiring for the village lending library. Most significantly, the carefully maintained distance between them gradually dissolved. Alexander would take her hand as they walked, or rest his palm at the small of her back when guiding her through doorways. Elizabeth found herself touching his arm during conversation, or adjusting his cravat with wifely familiarity. These small intimacies, unremarkable to observers but profound to them, marked the transformation of their relationship from contractual arrangement to genuine partnership. The village lending library opened on a bright morning in early summer, with half the village in attendance. Elizabeth had worked tirelessly to make the space welcoming, with comfortable seating areas and a carefully curated collection of books suitable for readers of all ages and education levels. Alexander stood beside her as she cut the ribbon, his pride in her accomplishment evident in his expression. "You have created something truly worthwhile," he told her, as they watched villagers eagerly exploring the collection. "This library will serve the community for generations." "It would not have been possible without your support," Elizabeth replied. "Both your financial backing and your faith in my ability to manage the project." "I had no doubt of your abilities," Alexander said, his hand finding hers. "You have exceeded every expectation, Elizabeth, in every regard." That evening, as they sat together in the library at Blackmore, Alexander set aside his book and regarded her with unusual seriousness. "There is something I wish to discuss with you." Elizabeth felt a flutter of apprehension. "And that sounds rather ominous." "Not ominous, merely significant." He paused, as though gathering his thoughts. "When I proposed our arrangement, I specified that we would maintain separate apartments and that certain obligations would only arise by mutual agreement." "I remember," Elizabeth said carefully, uncertain where this conversation led. "I wonder if you might consider, that is, I would very much like—" He stopped, frustration evident. "I am making a mess of this." Understanding dawned, bringing warmth to Elizabeth's cheeks. "Are you asking if I would welcome greater intimacy in our marriage?" Relief crossed his features. "Yes, precisely that. But I want to be clear that I am asking, not assuming or demanding. If you are content with our current arrangement, we can continue exactly as we are." Elizabeth considered her response carefully. The physical aspects of marriage had been entirely theoretical to her until now, yet she found the prospect of such intimacy with Alexander not frightening, but rather appealing. Their relationship had deepened considerably from its practical origins, and this seemed a natural progression. "I would welcome it," she said softly. "I confess to curiosity about that aspect of marriage." and I trust you to be considerate of my inexperience." Alexander took her hand, his grip gentle. "I give you my word that I will be patient and attentive to your comfort. This is new territory for us both, in a sense. I have had experience, but never within the context of genuine regard. I suspect it will be quite different." That night, Elizabeth's maid helped her prepare for bed with more than usual attention, braiding her long dark hair and arranging the fine linen nightgown that had been part of her trousseau but never yet worn. When Susan finally departed with a knowing smile, Elizabeth sat nervously on the edge of the bed, her heart racing with anticipation and trepidation. A soft knock came at the connecting door between their chambers. "Come in," Elizabeth called, her voice steadier than she felt. Alexander entered, wearing a dressing gown over his nightshirt, his dark hair slightly disheveled from removing his evening attire. He looked less ducal and more human than Elizabeth had ever seen him, which somehow eased her nervousness. "You look terrified," he observed with gentle humor, "and I promise I am not as fearsome as my reputation suggests." "I am not terrified," Elizabeth protested, then amended honestly, "merely apprehensive. This is rather new to me." "And to me, in the ways that matter," Alexander replied, crossing the room to sit beside her on the bed. "Elizabeth, if you have changed your mind, you need only say so. I will not press you." "I have not changed my mind," she assured him, reaching for his hand. "I simply do not know quite what to expect." "Then we shall discover together," he said, his free hand coming up to gently cup her face. "And we shall proceed slowly, at whatever pace you find comfortable." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion as Elizabeth responded with enthusiasm that surprised them both. What followed was a revelation of tenderness and mutual discovery. Alexander proving true to his word about patience, while Elizabeth found herself less shy than she had anticipated. Their union, when it finally occurred, sealed their transformation from contractual partners to true husband and wife in every sense. Afterward, as Elizabeth lay in Alexander's arms, her head resting on his chest, she felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. This was what she had unknowingly yearned for during those 5 years of sitting alone at balls. Not merely the security of marriage, but genuine connection with another soul. "I confess something to you," Alexander said into the comfortable silence, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "What is that?" "I did not encounter you by chance at Almack's that night. I had been observing you for some time, across multiple seasons." Elizabeth raised her head to look at him in surprise. "You had?" "I noticed you during your second season," he admitted. "There was something about the way you watched the proceedings with such intelligence in your eyes, as though you saw through society's pretensions. I found myself watching you rather than the celebrated beauties everyone else pursued." "Then why did you not approach me sooner?" "Because I convinced myself that my interest was merely abstract, that I was not suited for marriage, and should not encourage a woman who deserved better than what I thought I could offer." His arms tightened around her. "When I realized I needed a wife for practical reasons, you were the first person I thought of. I told myself it was because you would suit my requirements, but I suspect even then that I was deceiving myself about my true motivations." "Are you saying you married me for more than practical considerations?" Elizabeth asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I am saying that practical considerations gave me permission to pursue what I had denied wanting for years," Alexander replied. "I'm saying that I have been half in love with you since long before I ever spoke to you, and entirely in love with you since you looked me in the eye and negotiated terms for our marriage like a seasoned diplomat." Joy bloomed in Elizabeth's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "You love me." "Desperately," he confirmed, his dark eyes holding hers. "I know this is not what we agreed upon. I know you accepted this marriage for security, rather than affection. But I find I can no longer maintain the pretense that my feelings are merely those of respect and regard. I love you, Elizabeth Beaumont, and I hope that in time you might come to feel similarly about me." "Alexander," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I already do. I think I have been falling in love with you since you defended me to your mother, perhaps even before then. I tried to guard my heart, to maintain the practical distance we had agreed upon, but it proved impossible. You have shown me kindness, respect, and consideration beyond anything I dreamed possible. How could I not love you? He kissed her again, this time with a passion born of relief and joy. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling. I suppose this means our marriage of convenience has become rather inconvenient, Alexander observed with humor, and we can no longer maintain the fiction that this is merely a practical arrangement. Terribly inconvenient, Elizabeth agreed, nestling back into his embrace. Whatever shall we do? I suppose we shall have to admit defeat and accept that we have fallen into a love match, he replied, his tone deliberately grave despite the smile in his voice. How mortifying for two such practical people. Absolutely mortifying, Elizabeth agreed, then added more seriously, though I confess I have never been happier in my life. Nor I, Alexander said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You have transformed not just Blackmore, but my entire existence, Elizabeth. You have made me believe in possibilities I had long since dismissed as romantic fantasy, unsuited to men of my temperament. They talked long into the night, sharing confidences and dreams, learning one another's histories and hopes with the eagerness of new lovers. Elizabeth learned about Alexander's difficult relationship with his father, who had viewed emotion as weakness and had raised his son to value duty above all else. Alexander learned about Elizabeth's childhood love of learning, and how her father's financial struggles had curtailed her education just when her mind most craved expansion. As dawn began to paint the sky outside the window, Alexander reluctantly suggested they should attempt sleep. Though I confess I am loath to waste time sleeping when I could be conversing with you instead. We have the rest of our lives for conversation, Elizabeth pointed out, though she too felt reluctant to end their intimate discussion. The rest of our lives, Alexander repeated, as though testing the phrase. I find I rather like the sound of that. The following months brought continued deepening of their relationship. Alexander involved Elizabeth in estate decisions, valuing her perspective on matters of tenant welfare and agricultural improvements. They worked together on various reforms, he using his position in Parliament to champion progressive legislation, while she applied his principles locally through charitable works and educational initiatives. The village lending library flourished under Elizabeth's guidance, becoming a center of community activity. She established regular reading groups and began offering lessons in literacy to those who had never learned. Alexander watched her work with undisguised pride, often remarking that her contributions to the estate's welfare exceeded his own. Their love became known throughout the district, the romantic story of the Duke who had married the overlooked Miss Thornton spreading through local society. What had begun as scandal transformed into something approaching fairy tale, proof that genuine regard could develop from the most practical of beginnings. One autumn evening, as they sat together in the library, Alexander reading correspondence while Elizabeth worked on her embroidery, he suddenly set aside his papers with unusual abruptness. I have received an interesting letter, he announced, his expression difficult to read. Oh, Elizabeth set aside her needlework, giving him her full attention. It is from my mother. She has written to request permission to visit Blackmore, to meet you properly and to extend her apologies for her previous behavior. Elizabeth felt a flutter of apprehension. And how do you feel about this request? I am uncertain, Alexander admitted. Part of me wishes to refuse, to protect you from any possibility of her cruelty. Yet another part recognizes that family estrangements serve no one well. What is your opinion? Elizabeth considered carefully. I think that if she has genuinely reconsidered her position, it would be gracious to allow her the opportunity to make amends. Family is important, Alexander, even difficult family, and I am not so fragile as to be wounded by harsh words. You are remarkably forgiving, he observed. I am practical, Elizabeth corrected with a slight smile. Maintaining hostilities with your mother serves no purpose and may cause you continued pain. If there is a possibility of reconciliation, it seems worth exploring. Very well, Alexander agreed. I shall invite her to visit for a week, though I warn you that my mother is not easily softened. She may maintain her disapproval despite this overture. The Dowager Duchess arrived on a gray November afternoon, her posture as rigid as Elizabeth remembered. Alexander greeted his mother with cool courtesy, while Elizabeth executed a perfect curtsy that acknowledged the dowager's rank while maintaining her own dignity as the current duchess. Mother, may I present my wife, Elizabeth, Duchess of Pemberton. Elizabeth, my mother, the Dowager Duchess. Your Grace, Elizabeth said warmly, you are welcome at Blackmore. The Dowager studied her with sharp eyes, clearly assessing. You are younger than I expected, she said finally, and less plain than I had been led to believe. I am 24, Elizabeth replied calmly, and I have been variously described as plain, passable, and pleasant in appearance, depending upon the observer's charity. Something flickered in the Dowager's expression, surprise perhaps at Elizabeth's directness. But you speak frankly. I have found that honesty serves better than false modesty or excessive pride, Elizabeth replied. Your Grace, I understand that you have concerns about my suitability as Duchess of Pemberton. I cannot change my origins or my lack of fashionable connections. I can only demonstrate through my actions that I take my responsibilities seriously, and that I care deeply for your son's welfare and happiness. The Dowager's stern expression softened fractionally. My son appears well, better than I have seen him in some time, if I am honest. He is an extraordinary man, Elizabeth said simply. I count myself fortunate to be his wife. Come, the Dowager said after a long moment. Show me these improvements I have heard about. The lending library and the tenant cottages. I wish to see what has been accomplished. The visit proved surprisingly successful. While the Dowager never became warm, she gradually thawed from hostile to grudgingly approving. She observed Elizabeth's interactions with the staff, her management of household affairs, and her charitable works in the village. By the week's end, she requested a private conversation with Elizabeth. I owe you an apology, the Dowager began without preamble as they sat in the morning room. I judged you without knowledge, based solely upon prejudice about your circumstances. I see now that you bring qualities to this marriage that have nothing to do with fortune or family connections. That is generous of you to say, Your Grace, Elizabeth replied. It is truth, not generosity, the Dowager corrected. You have made Alexander happy. I have not seen that expression on his face since before his father died. Whatever my concerns about your origins, I cannot deny that you have been good for my son. I love him, Elizabeth said simply. That was not part of our original agreement, but it has become the truth of our marriage. I would do anything in my power to ensure his happiness. I believe you would, the Dowager said, her expression softening, and I believe he would do the same for you. Perhaps I was wrong to place so much importance on bloodlines and connections. Alexander has found something more valuable than social prestige in you. The reconciliation between Alexander and his mother progressed slowly, but by the time the Dowager departed, a tentative peace had been established. As Alexander and Elizabeth waved farewell to the departing carriage, he pulled her close against his side. You have performed a miracle, he said. I had despaired of ever having civil relations with my mother again. I merely showed her that I care for you, Elizabeth replied. The rest was her own recognition that her son's happiness matters more than her pride. Still, it required your patience and grace to create the possibility, Alexander insisted. He turned to face her fully, his hands cupping her face with tender possession. Have I mentioned recently that I love you beyond measure? Not since this morning, Elizabeth replied with mock severity. I was beginning to wonder if you had reconsidered. Never, he said fervently, before claiming her lips in a kiss that left no doubt of his continued devotion. Winter settled over Blackmore, transforming the estate into a landscape of austere beauty. Elizabeth and Alexander spent their evenings by the fire, reading to one another or simply talking about anything and everything. She learned about his dreams for agricultural reform, and his concerns about labor conditions in the industrial cities. He learned about her desire to establish schools for girls and her belief that education was the key to improving society. "You should do it," Alexander said one evening as she spoke of her educational dreams. "Establish a school here on the estate. We have the resources, and God knows there is need for such an institution." Truly, Elizabeth's eyes lit with excitement. "You would support such a venture?" "I would do more than support it. I would help you plan and implement it," he replied. "You have proven yourself remarkably capable with the lending library. I have every confidence in your ability to manage a school as well." "It would be expensive," Elizabeth warned, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. "I have considerable wealth with limited ways to spend it meaningfully," Alexander pointed out. "Educating the next generation seems an infinitely better use of resources than most expenditures the aristocracy makes." They began planning immediately, consulting with educators and examining models from successful schools elsewhere. By spring, they had purchased a suitable building in the village and begun renovations. Elizabeth threw herself into curriculum planning and teacher recruitment with infectious enthusiasm that made Alexander fall even more deeply in love with her, if such a thing were possible. The school opened the following autumn, accepting 30 girls from the estate and surrounding villages regardless of their families' ability to pay. Elizabeth served as one of the primary teachers, instructing in literature and history with a passion that inspired her students. Alexander would sometimes observe from the back of the classroom, marveling at the transformation of the shy wallflower he had proposed to into this confident, purposeful woman who commanded respect through genuine dedication rather than mere rank. On the evening of the school's first anniversary, Alexander presented Elizabeth with a gift, a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "For recording your thoughts and experiences," he explained. "You are accomplishing remarkable things, Aunt Elizabeth. Future generations should know about the woman who believed that every girl deserved education, regardless of her circumstances." Elizabeth was touched beyond words. She opened the journal to find Alexander had already made the first entry, a poem he had written about watching her teach, about the light that illuminated her face when discussing literature with her students, about his pride in calling her his wife. "I did not know you wrote poetry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I do not generally," he admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. "But you inspire me to attempt expressions I never considered before. It is probably terrible poetry, but it is honest." "It is beautiful," Elizabeth assured him, tears streaming down her face as she read his words. "You are beautiful, Alexander Beaumont, in ways that have nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the goodness of your heart." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "We have built something together, Elizabeth. Not just a marriage, but a true partnership. You have made me better than I was, more compassionate, more willing to use my position for meaningful change rather than merely maintaining tradition. And you have given me purpose and agency I never dreamed possible," Elizabeth replied. "You saw value in me when I had ceased to see it in myself. You gave me opportunities to make a genuine difference in people's lives. I owe you everything." "You owe me nothing," Alexander corrected gently. "Everything you have accomplished has been through your own effort and vision. I merely provided resources. The true work has been yours." As they stood together in their library, surrounded by books and the warmth of home, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been the invisible Miss Thornton, resigned to a life of quiet desperation on the margins of society. Now she was the Duchess of Pemberton, educator, reformer, and most improbably of all, a woman deeply loved by a man she had come to love in return. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night at Almack's?" Elizabeth asked suddenly. "Which part?" Alexander smiled. "I recall making several presumptuous statements. You said that those who claim to be uninteresting are often the most fascinating upon closer acquaintance." "And I was proven correct," Alexander replied. "You are endlessly fascinating, my love." "As are you," Elizabeth countered. The fearsome Iron Duke proved to have the warmest heart hidden beneath all that formidable exterior. "Only for you," he said softly. "You alone have seen the man beneath the Duke." Their kiss was interrupted by a knock at the library door. Mrs. Crawford entered with apologies for the disturbance. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Waverley has arrived unexpectedly and requests an audience with His Grace." Alexander frowned. "Waverley? At this hour?" "He says it is a matter of some urgency regarding parliamentary business, Your Grace." "Very well. Show him to my study. I will join him presently." After Mrs. Crawford departed, Alexander turned to Elizabeth with regret. "I am sorry to cut short our evening." "Parliamentary business takes precedence," Elizabeth assured him. "Go tend to your duties. I shall be here when you finish." But Lord Waverley's visit proved to be more than routine parliamentary business. When Alexander returned to their chambers hours later, his expression was troubled. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked immediately, setting aside her book. "Waverley came to warn me," Alexander said, pouring himself a brandy with unsteady hands. "There are forces moving against me in Parliament, powerful men who object to the reforms I have been championing. They plan to orchestrate my social ruin through scandal and innuendo, to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that my political influence becomes worthless." "What sort of scandal?" Elizabeth asked, though she already suspected the answer. "They intend to revive questions about our marriage," Alexander replied bitterly. "To spread rumors that it was a transaction, that I purchased you to serve as social camouflage while maintaining mistresses elsewhere, that our union is a sham designed to manipulate the court of public opinion." "But none of that is true," Elizabeth protested. "Truth is irrelevant when reputation is at stake," Alexander said wearily. "If they succeed in making our marriage appear fraudulent, they undermine everything I have worked for. Reform-minded peers will distance themselves to avoid association with scandal. My ability to champion progressive legislation will be destroyed." Elizabeth rose and went to him, taking the brandy from his hand and setting it aside. "Then we must demonstrate that their lies are false. We must show society that our marriage is genuine in every way that matters." "How do you propose we do that?" Alexander asked. "Society will believe salacious gossip over simple denials." "Then we do not simply deny," Elizabeth replied, her mind working through possibilities. "We demonstrate. We have been living quietly at Blackmore, avoiding London society. That very privacy has allowed these rumors to flourish. We must return to London, attend social functions, allow people to observe our genuine regard for one another." "You would subject yourself to that scrutiny?" Alexander asked. "Elizabeth, society can be cruel. They will watch for any hint of artifice, any suggestion that our affection is performed rather than genuine." "Let them watch," Elizabeth said firmly. "Let them see that the Duke of Pemberton and his Duchess are genuinely devoted to one another. Our love is real, Alexander. Surely that reality will be evident to anyone who observes us with unprejudiced eyes." Alexander pulled back slightly to search her face. "What is it?" "Are you well?" "I am very well," Elizabeth assured him, taking his hand and placing it gently on her abdomen. "In fact, I believe we are expecting a child." For a moment, Alexander simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then joy flooded his features, transforming them completely. "Truly, we are to have a child." "I believe so, yes. It is still early, but all the signs suggest it." He laughed, a sound of pure delight, and kissed her thoroughly, heedless of the fact that they were in a carriage in public view. "This is extraordinary news. A child. Elizabeth, you have made me happier than I ever thought possible." "The timing is rather unfortunate, given the gossip," Elizabeth said with a slight grimace. "Some will claim this proves their accusations." "Let them claim whatever they wish," Alexander replied, his hand still resting protectively over where their child grew. "We know the truth. Our child was conceived in love, and that is all that matters." The announcement of the Duchess of Pemberton's condition several weeks later effectively silenced the remaining gossips. The Duke's obvious joy and the Duchess's evident happiness made claims of a loveless marriage appear ridiculous. Society, always eager to embrace a new narrative, transformed the Pembertons from scandal to romance, the wallflower who had captured the heart of the formidable Iron Duke. The months of Elizabeth's confinement passed peacefully at Blackmore, where Alexander fussed over her with endearing concern, insisting she rest more than necessary and consulting multiple physicians about her care. She bore his attention with amused tolerance, finding his worry rather touching. "You do realize that women have been having babies since the dawn of time," she reminded him one afternoon, as he arranged cushions behind her for the third time. "Yes, but they were not carrying my child," Alexander replied. "The circumstances are entirely different." "How so?" "Because I love you, and the thought of anything happening to you terrifies me beyond reason," he admitted, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "I know I am being absurd, but I cannot seem to help myself." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "I promise to be very careful and to follow the physician's every instruction. But you must promise to stop treating me as though I am made of spun glass. I am stronger than I appear." "I know you are," Alexander said softly. "It is one of the many things I love about you." Their daughter was born on a bright May morning, arriving with lusty cries that announced her vigorous health. Alexander, who had worn a path in the carpet outside Elizabeth's chamber during her labor, burst into tears of relief when the midwife finally allowed him entry to meet his child. "She is perfect," he breathed, gazing at the tiny infant in Elizabeth's arms. "Absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold her?" Elizabeth asked, exhausted but radiant. Alexander accepted the bundle with trembling hands, his expression one of wonder as he studied his daughter's miniature features. "She has your eyes," he said, "or she will, when they darken. And look at these tiny fingers. She is a miracle, Elizabeth. An absolute miracle." They named her Catherine Eleanor, after Alexander's grandmother and Elizabeth's mother. The baby thrived, growing plump and healthy under the devoted care of her parents and the household staff, all of whom doted shamelessly upon the young heir to the Pemberton Duchy. "We shall spoil her terribly," Alexander observed one evening as they watched their 3-month-old daughter sleep in her cradle. "Undoubtedly," Elizabeth agreed, "though I suspect she will turn out well regardless. She has inherited your determination. Have you noticed how she refuses to give up when trying to grasp her rattle? And your kindness," Alexander added. "She smiles at everyone, even when she has every right to be cross." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Elizabeth resumed her work with the school, bringing Catherine with her on occasion so the students could observe infant care as part of their education. Alexander continued his political reforms, now with even greater determination, inspired by the desire to create a better world for his daughter. The Dowager Duchess became a regular visitor, her previous hostility entirely evaporated in the face of her granddaughter's charms. She and Elizabeth developed a cordial relationship, bonding over Catherine's care and, surprisingly, over their shared interest in botanical studies. "I misjudged you severely," the Dowager admitted one afternoon as they walked through Blackmore's gardens, Catherine sleeping peacefully in her grandmother's arms. "You have been good for Alexander in ways I never anticipated. He is a better man, a happier man than I have ever known him to be." "He was always a good man," Elizabeth replied gently. "He simply needed permission to show that side of himself." "Perhaps," the Dowager conceded. "I know perhaps he needed the right woman to bring it forth. In any case, I am grateful that he found you, Miss Thorne. Elizabeth. May I call you Elizabeth?" "I would like that very much, Your Grace," Elizabeth replied with genuine warmth. As the years passed, Elizabeth and Alexander's love deepened rather than diminished, each year bringing new layers of understanding and appreciation. They had 2 more children, a son named George after Alexander's brother, and another daughter, Harriet, named for Elizabeth's cousin who had married well and remained a close friend. The school Elizabeth had founded flourished, eventually expanding to include housing for girls from distant areas who showed particular academic promise. Several of her early students went on to become teachers themselves, spreading Elizabeth's educational philosophy throughout the region. Alexander's political reforms gradually gained acceptance, though not without significant struggle. He became known as one of the most principled members of the House of Lords, a man whose word could be trusted and whose dedication to justice was beyond question. His political success, he always maintained, was built upon the foundation of his stable home life and the support of his remarkable wife. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Alexander surprised Elizabeth with a gift, a portrait he had commissioned of her teaching in the village school, surrounded by her students. In the painting, her face glowed with the passion and purpose that had come to define her life. "This is how I see you," Alexander explained as Elizabeth studied the portrait with tears in her eyes. Not as the Wallflower Society overlooked, but as the extraordinary woman who has touched countless lives through her dedication and compassion. "This is who you truly are, Elizabeth. It is who you allowed me to become," Elizabeth replied, turning to embrace him. "When you asked me to dance that night at Almack's, you gave me more than just security or social position. You gave me the opportunity to discover who I was meant to be." "I merely provided the opportunity," Alexander corrected. "The transformation was entirely your own work. You have exceeded every expectation, mine and society's. You have built something meaningful and lasting, both in our family and in the wider community." That evening, as they sat together in their library as they had done countless times before, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 10 years ago, she had been invisible, resigned to a life on society's margins. Now she was surrounded by love, by purpose, by the richness of a life well lived. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Alexander suddenly. "Our practical arrangement? Do you ever wish you had married someone more suitable, someone with better connections or greater beauty?" Alexander set aside his book and regarded her with such tender intensity that her breath caught. "Elizabeth Beaumont, you are the greatest blessing of my existence. Every day with you is a gift I never expected to receive. I loved you before I truly knew you, and I love you more with each passing year. There is nothing and no one I would change about our life together. Even when I am being stubborn about school curriculum," Elizabeth teased. "Especially then," Alexander replied with a smile. "Your passion and determination are among your most admirable qualities. Though I confess your stubbornness can be rather trying when you decide I'm wrong about something. Which is not often, but does occasionally occur," Elizabeth pointed out. "Very occasionally," Alexander agreed, pulling her into his arms. "Perhaps once or twice in our entire marriage." "Only once or twice," Elizabeth laughed. "Your memory is remarkably selective, my love." "As is yours, apparently," Alexander replied, before silencing any further argument with a kiss. Their children grew, each developing distinct personalities. Catherine proved to be serious and scholarly, with her mother's love of learning and her father's determination. George was more light-hearted, with an easy charm that won hearts wherever he went. Little Harriet, still in the nursery, showed signs of her namesake's vivacity combined with her mother's kindness. Elizabeth and Alexander worked together to ensure their children understood the responsibility that came with privilege. Catherine often accompanied her mother to the school, while George learned estate management alongside his father. They emphasized education, compassion, and the importance of using one's advantages to benefit others. "We are raising the next generation of reformers," Alexander observed one evening as they watched their children play in the gardens. "Or at least responsible stewards of the blessings they have received," Elizabeth replied. "I want them to understand that their position in society is not evidence of their superiority, but an accident of birth that carries obligations to those less fortunate. You have given them an extraordinary example to follow," Alexander said, "both in your charitable works and in your determination to see every person's inherent worth, regardless of their circumstances." "I learned that lesson myself," Elizabeth reminded him. "Society judged me unworthy for 5 years because I lacked fortune and connections. I know intimately what it feels like to be overlooked and undervalued. I never want our children to inflict that experience upon others." The village school celebrated its 15th anniversary with a grand ceremony attended by local gentry and political figures who had heard of its success. Elizabeth stood before the assembly, somewhat uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the opportunity to speak about the importance of education. 15 years ago, she began, I was given an extraordinary gift, the resources and opportunity to pursue a dream. That dream was simple, to ensure that every girl, regardless of her family's circumstances, might have access to education and the opportunities that education provides. She paused, her eyes finding Alexander in the crowd. He smiled at her with such pride and love that she felt her confidence strengthen. What began as one small school has grown beyond anything I imagined. Our students have become teachers, governesses, and skilled tradeswomen. Some have married well, using their education to manage households and raise educated children of their own. Others have remained unmarried, supporting themselves through their learning and skills. All have been given choices they would not have had otherwise. The applause when she finished was thunderous. Local families whose daughters had attended the school pressed forward to thank her, sharing stories of how education had transformed their lives. Elizabeth accepted their gratitude with humility, always quick to credit the teachers and supporters who had made the school's success possible. That evening, as she and Alexander prepared for bed, she confessed to feeling overwhelmed by the attention. I am not accustomed to being the center of such focus. It feels strange after so many years of invisibility. You must become accustomed to it, Alexander replied, brushing her long hair with gentle strokes. You have accomplished something remarkable, Elizabeth. People naturally wish to acknowledge and celebrate that accomplishment. I suppose, Elizabeth conceded, though I confess I preferred the work itself to the recognition for it. That, my love, is precisely what makes you worthy of recognition, Alexander said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You pursue meaningful work for its own sake, not for acclaim or social advantage. It is one of the many reasons I love you. As the years continued to pass, Elizabeth and Alexander's reputation grew beyond Derbyshire. They became known throughout England as exemplars of aristocratic responsibility, using their considerable resources and influence to champion progressive causes. Alexander's political career flourished, his reforms gradually reshaping England's approach to labor, education, and social welfare. Elizabeth's educational initiatives expanded to include schools in 3 counties, each one founded on her principles of accessible education for all. Their marriage became something of a legend, the practical arrangement that had transformed into one of the great love stories of their generation. Young ladies who had suffered through unsuccessful seasons would hear of Elizabeth's story and take heart that their time might yet come. Gentlemen seeking wives began to look beyond the obvious beauties to notice quieter women of substance and character. On their 20th anniversary, Alexander arranged a grand ball at Blackmore, inviting not just the aristocracy but also representatives from all the charitable organizations they supported, teachers from Elizabeth's schools, and tenant families from the estate. It was an unprecedented mixing of classes that scandalized some traditionalists but reflected the values that had come to define the Pemberton household. As they opened the ball with a waltz, Elizabeth was transported back to that night at Almack's 20 years earlier, when the formidable Duke of Pemberton had shocked society by dancing with the invisible Miss Thornton. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked, noticing her distant expression. "I was remembering the first time we danced," Elizabeth replied. "How terrified I was, how certain I was that nothing would come of it beyond brief notoriety. And instead, everything came of it," Alexander said, holding her closer. "A lifetime of partnership, love, and shared purpose. 3 extraordinary children. Meaningful work that has improved countless lives. I would call that rather more than brief notoriety." "Rather more indeed," Elizabeth agreed, her eyes bright with emotion. "You changed my life that night, Alexander. You saw me when I had become invisible even to myself." "I have always seen you, Elizabeth," Alexander replied seriously. "From the very beginning, I saw your worth, your potential, your extraordinary spirit. I am grateful beyond measure that you allowed me to be part of your journey, to witness the flowering of all that potential into the remarkable woman you have become." The waltz ended to enthusiastic applause from their assembled guests. As they left the floor, their eldest daughter Catherine approached with her father's serious expression. "Mama, Papa, some of the young ladies from the school are here, and they are terribly nervous about dancing with the gentlemen present. Might I suggest that Mama speak with them? Her own experience might provide encouragement." Elizabeth smiled at her daughter's thoughtfulness. "Of course. Will you accompany me, Catherine? You have grown into such a confident young woman. Your example might inspire them as well." As mother and daughter moved toward the group of shy students hovering at the edge of the ballroom, Alexander watched with profound satisfaction. This was his legacy, not just the political reforms or the improved estates, but this family he had built with Elizabeth, these values they had instilled in their children, this ripple effect of compassion and opportunity spreading outward through countless lives. "Your Grace." A young gentleman approached, one of the reform-minded MPs who had recently joined Alexander's political efforts. "I wanted to thank you for this evening. My wife and I have been deeply inspired by your example and that of the Duchess. We are considering establishing a similar school in our own district." "That would be splendid," Alexander replied warmly. "I shall have the Duchess send you detailed information about curriculum and administration. She has refined the model considerably over the years." "If I may ask, Your Grace, how did you recognize the Duchess's potential when society had overlooked her for so long?" Alexander considered the question thoughtfully. "I did not overlook her," he said simply. "While others focused on superficial qualities, I noticed her intelligence, her dignity in difficult circumstances, her genuine character. True worth is not always immediately obvious, but it is always present for those willing to look beyond surface appearances." The young MP nodded thoughtfully. A lesson worth remembering in many contexts, political as well as personal. "Indeed," Alexander agreed. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself surrounded by young women from her schools, each sharing their aspirations and dreams. Some wished to become teachers themselves, others spoke of learning trades or establishing businesses. All credited Elizabeth's belief in their potential as the catalyst for their ambitions. "You gave us hope," one young woman said, her eyes bright with gratitude. "You showed us that our circumstances need not define our futures, that with education and determination, we could create lives of meaning and purpose." "You created those lives yourselves," Elizabeth replied warmly. "I merely provided access to knowledge. The courage to use that knowledge, to pursue your dreams despite obstacles that came from within yourselves." Later, as the ball wound down and guests began to depart, Elizabeth and Alexander found themselves alone for a moment on the terrace where they had stood so many times before. 20 years, Elizabeth mused, leaning into her husband's embrace. "It seems both a lifetime and merely a moment." "The best 20 years of my existence, Mo," Alexander replied, his arms tightening around her. "And merely the beginning, I hope. We have many more years ahead of us, many more dreams to pursue together." "What dreams do you have, my love?" Elizabeth asked curiously. "We have accomplished so much already. I dream of seeing our children grown and happy, pursuing their own purposes with the values we have instilled," Alexander replied. "I dream of continuing to work for a more just society alongside the woman who has been my inspiration in all things. I dream of growing old with you, Elizabeth, watching grandchildren play in these gardens, knowing that together we have built something lasting and meaningful." "Those are beautiful dreams," Elizabeth said softly. "Dreams I share completely." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the last carriages depart down the long drive. The house behind them glowed with warm light, their children's laughter drifting through the open windows. This was home, not just a place but a feeling, a tapestry woven from love, purpose, and shared commitment to living lives of meaning. "I sat alone at balls for 5 years," Elizabeth said suddenly, echoing words she had spoken long ago. Invisible, overlooked, convinced my life would be lived on the margins of other people's happiness. And then, Alexander prompted, though he knew the answer. Oh. And then the most powerful duke in England asked for my hand in a waltz. Elizabeth finished, turning in his arms to face him. And everything changed. Not just my circumstances, but my understanding of what was possible, what I was capable of, who I could become given the opportunity. You would have become extraordinary regardless, Alexander insisted. I merely had the wisdom to recognize what others missed and the great fortune to convince you to share your life with me. We have been fortunate together, Elizabeth agreed. But it was more than fortune, Alexander. It was choice. We chose to transform a practical arrangement into genuine partnership. We chose love over convenience, purpose over mere comfort. Those choices made all the difference. They did indeed, Alexander agreed, bending to capture her lips in a kiss that still, after 20 years, made her heart race. As they returned to the house arm in arm, Elizabeth reflected on the unpredictable nature of life's journey. She had entered into marriage expecting nothing beyond security and perhaps companionship. Instead, she had found passionate love, meaningful work, a family that filled her heart to overflowing, and the satisfaction of knowing her life had touched others in positive ways. The invisible wallflower had become the celebrated duchess, not through change of circumstances alone, but through the revelation of qualities that had always existed within her, waiting for recognition and opportunity. Alexander had provided both, and in doing so had received back more than he had given, a wife who challenged him, inspired him, and loved him with unwavering devotion. Their story would be told for generations, the practical arrangement that became a love match, the overlooked girl who became an agent of change, the formidable duke who proved to have the warmest heart. But the true magic of their story was not in its romantic elements, but in its essential truth. That genuine connection, built on respect and shared values, can transform not just individual lives, but the world around them. As Elizabeth climbed the stairs to their chamber that night, Alexander's hand warm in hers, she smiled at the young woman she glimpsed in the portrait hanging in the hall, the scared girl who had accepted a duke's practical proposal with clear eyes and cautious heart. If she could speak to that younger self, she would offer this wisdom. Sometimes the greatest risks yield the most extraordinary rewards, and love, true love, often arrives when and how we least expect it. But perhaps that younger Elizabeth had known, on some level, what she was choosing when she placed her hand in Alexander's that night at Almack's. Perhaps she had recognized, even then, the possibility of transformation. Perhaps that was why she had said yes when every practical consideration might have counseled refusal. In the end, it did not matter whether she had known or merely hoped. What mattered was that she had taken the chance, had stepped onto that ballroom floor despite her fear, had allowed herself to be seen despite years of invisibility. That single moment of courage had opened the door to everything that followed. And what had followed was a life beyond her wildest imaginings, rich with love, purpose, family, and the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. From invisible wallflower to beloved duchess, from resigned spinster to passionate reformer, from practical arrangement to enduring love, Elizabeth's journey had exceeded every expectation. As she settled into bed beside her husband, feeling his arm come around her in the familiar embrace that still brought comfort after 20 years, Elizabeth offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the dance that had changed everything, for the man who had seen her worth, for the love that had transformed them both, for the life they had built together, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "And I love you," Alexander replied, his voice warm with the affection that had only deepened over the years. "Always and forever, my Elizabeth, always and forever." It was a promise he had kept and would continue keeping for all the years remaining to them. And Elizabeth, lying safe in her husband's arms, knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, living exactly the life she was meant to live, loved by exactly the man she was meant to love. The invisible girl had been seen at last. And in being seen, she had discovered not just love but herself, the woman she had always been capable of becoming, waiting beneath the surface for recognition and opportunity. It was, she reflected as sleep began to claim her, quite the most perfect ending. Or rather, as endings and beginnings are merely different perspectives on the same continuous journey, quite the most perfect continuation of the story that had begun with a single waltz and would continue as long as they both should live. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance. The end.